South Africans await tomorrow's budget speech to see where government plans to get revenue it needs to fulfill its mandate. The February 2025 budget was rejected due to a proposed 2 percentage point increase in VAT aimed at financing increase in non-interest spending. We now bring in Dr Nthabiseng Moleko from Stellenbosch University. Dr. Moleko, thank you for joining us and welcome to On Point. We approach this budget with different circumstances, considering what happened, of course, last month. How different do you think tomorrow's budget is going to be?
Well, very good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. I think the first thing is that the reality is the imposition of budget increases in the form of tax and in the form of increased taxation have to now go through not just engagement, but serious consultation prior to being effected. I think we come from a history where it was a ruling party that determined the direction of the budget. But now considerations have to be made and ensure consensus so that it's actually voted for and passed through the appropriate channel. So I think the difference is that, number one, consultation is underpinning the outcome and the approval process of this budget. I think the second consideration is that taking into serious account the implication of any VAT increase on the low income threshold or the poor, I think that has been taken far seriously than it was prior. I think initially the ministry that had proposed the budget, of course, through the Ministry of Finance, had expected that, the budget would simply be approved. And this was not the case. So I think the expectation now is to take into consideration the different constituencies, the impact of any taxation. So whether it's the corporate tax on the corporates, whether it's the VAT on the low income threshold, and any other type implementation of tax increase will likely to have an adverse effect as much as it will increase the collections. It may have more of an unintended consequence, and that has to be taken into consideration.
Yeah. Between then and now, so many other things have, taken place. Do you think that the budget will plug the gap that, for instance, has been left by the withdrawal of aid by the US, especially when it comes to health spending? Now we're sitting with people who potentially do not have work anymore, but also programs that have stopped. Do you think that the minister would have had time to consider those things before tomorrow?
So if you look at the previous budget, which is the forecast for what is likely to come, the medium-term budget policy statement, there's no ways that the 8 billion loss that is estimated from the withdrawal of aid and the compensation of employees for thousands of workers is likely to have been budgeted for and planned in the short space of time that we have. So the seriousness of it means that the cut in expenditure from the aid support is going to have a devastating consequence on those programs, particularly the TB and the HIV-related programs. I do believe that the South African government, the ARV treatment and the ARV support is within our own budget, but I think there's additional support that is provided through the aid programs. So I don't believe that that has been accounted for. What we do know is that the SRD grant, which Treasury is currently appealing, which they didn't budget for, the cost of that is an additional 190 billion estimated in the 3 years, 191 billion. And each year, the Treasury is trying to raise approximately 60 billion plus minus. And you're seeing this additional VAT 2.2% increase was going to try to increase the collection of that shortage or that gap. So some of these serious gaps then mean if you cannot increase revenue, you're likely to have or foresee a reduction in expenditure in serious programs. And we've seen already austerity, we have seen primary budget surplus, we've also seen non-interest expenditure actually reaching a budget surplus and then not seeing a deficit as we had seen in the year, so that they can contain that debt to GDP ratio at the targeted 76% to GDP.
Yeah. Speaking of the debt to GDP ratio, it remains obviously quite high. What is the likelihood that because of this consultation that now needs to happen, maybe the Treasury will say, fine, this means that we can go borrow more, thereby increasing our debt to GDP ratio even higher?
So the challenge here is that the trade-off to increase borrowing is the debt servicing cost. We're already spending 21% of our collections on servicing debt. Economically speaking, that means every R1 that is collected, 20 to 21 cents is spent paying back interest that we owe on debt. So it actually is a regressive action to simply borrow from Peter to pay Paul. We simply have to look at alternative ways to try and expand output. And we also, with the monies that we have borrowed, I don't believe we have used efficiently, and we haven't used them to widen growth and economic output to beyond 1%, 1.6. So the estimates right now, we have seen the forecasted growth and output being forecasted between 1.6, 1.9%. Every time they're revised downwards. So we're seeing in actual reality terms, the last quarter growth and the annual growth for the year was 0.6%.
Yeah.
What that means is that we're not collecting sufficient revenue from taxes, corporate tax, income tax, PAYE, excise taxes, VAT, all of them, because we're simply not having enough people working.
Yeah.
We don't have enough businesses that we can take this tax from and collect it from. And also the revenue generated, certain subsectors are actually contracting. We're deindustrializing, mining companies are closing down. So we are not able to continue at the pace where we are at. I think the reality now, if we continue to simply borrow from Peter to pay Paul, fiscal consolidation isn't going to be a success.
Yeah.
But also, we're not using the money wisely. And I think there are some positive signs on infrastructure investment and also the BFI window, which is the infrastructure finance grant, that we're seeing an expansion towards more improving our marginal productivity of capital so that we can invest in catalytic infrastructure that is going to equate to economic multiplier effects, but also widen output and economic activity in some of the economic nodes where we haven't seen this.
Dr. Moleko, thank you so much. Always a great pleasure speaking to you. Let's see what happens tomorrow and what is contained in that budget speech. Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko is with the Stellenbosch University, and she is an economist. There is a call for an